Hello, welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. And this is, of course, the lockdown edition. We're coming to you from my study. So if we are interrupted by any of the normal sounds of family life, that could be children screaming, shouting, fighting, running in here, demanding access to the piano, I apologise. I hope the technical quality is okay. And we're asking our guests to do their best. So I hope you enjoy it. We thought it was really important just to get back on air, if you like, and not be sort of floored by lockdown. And my guest this week is somebody who I find it hard to be being floored by anything, really. Deborah Frances-White is a comedian, author, screenwriter. She's probably best known, of course, for the Guilty Feminist, which is a hugely successful podcast, but has also sort of got all sorts of branches now, whether it's books or a new sort of Instagram idea that she can tell us about. So hello, Deborah, how are you?
Hello, Krishnan. So lovely to be here. I'm actually okay this week in lockdown.
Yeah, how is your lockdown?
Well, I think I've hit the point where I've got Stockholm syndrome. I actually like it in here, and I'm a bit worried about having to emerge from my cocoon because my life was quite frenetic. And at first I did not handle it at all well. The first week, honestly, it was like the only thing I could equate it to was a caffeine withdrawal headache, except I was withdrawing from the caffeine of humanity. And I found it absolutely devastating because suddenly I had to learn all of this new technology. And I'm not good with technology, Krishnan. I'm good with people. And the people were gone. And I was like, what is this? In order to talk to anyone, I've got to learn all of this. But then week two, people are very plastic and malleable and we cope. So week two, I was like, right, let's get into some serious hardcore coping. Now I'm like a little bit worried about having to emerge.
And have you embraced the technology or just kind of gone into a nice cozy cocoon at home?
I have embraced the technology. I kind of have to because I think without people, I will wither. I'm an extrovert, which means apparently I get my energy from other people. An introvert gets their energy from alone time, and I need alone time. But I recharge my batteries from this that we're doing right now.
That's an interesting definition. I haven't heard that one before. So extroverts, who you think of as very energetic and domineering, I suppose, in a way, are actually leeches drawing their energy from other people.
That is correct. We are energy vampires. That is correct. No, I just think it's like, where do you get your buzz from? So if you've had a whole week alone and you're feeling really flat, is it going out and being with people? It could be being in a cafe. Like for me, the thing I miss the most is actually being out alone, like being in a cafe and, there's a couple at the next table that are on a first date. There's a couple over there that are trying to make a business deal. That guy's writing a screenplay. I love that. I love just being amongst humanity and observing that and feeling the energy from that. And I do crave that. But you find your ways. We are very plastic. My husband and I live with a Syrian refugee who is now family to us. Feels very odd to describe him as a Syrian refugee because he's lived with us for nearly 3 years and he is as much family to me as any other human being in the world. And he's actually gone to stay with friends in the country for lockdown, and which was a good call because he's like, 27 and they're sort of young people running around outside. But he has taught me so much about coping, your capabilities, your ability to morph and adapt, to shelve the trauma while you're living through it and take it off the shelf later. And living with him as he has been healing through some post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, he's a very, very dignified man and a very, very a man of great capability and very, very, very articulate. But he talks through those things with great emotional intelligence, and it's really, really helpful.
So has he talked to you specifically about dealing with the trauma of a radical change to your life?
Yes. What he says, he actually wrote an article for the British GQ, and we tossed around ideas together. So we talked about it a lot together, and he wrote a very beautiful piece for them that said, look, refugees we're old hands at this. Let me give you some advice. I think it's actually called We Are All Refugees Now. And he says within the article that's hyperbolic. But the reason I'm saying that is the change is foisted upon you. It's just happened to you. You have no choice. You did not ask for this change. You did not want this change. It is a dramatic change. You now have to adapt to it. But you are already doing that. You've already started. Look around you. You're not doing today what you were doing last week before the lockdown. And so it goes into the ways we are already coping. And when Steve first moved in, I used to feel bad about my first world problems sometimes. I remember my suitcase got lost and I'd been on some, speaking tour. So it had all of my poshest frocks in, Krishnan. I'll let that sit with you for a second as you understand my real posh. It had a Vivienne Westwood dress in it. So it was from a previous season. I was never going to be able to get that perfect dress back. It was my perfect black dress. And it got lost and they just said, look, we might find it, we might not, we don't know. And I was like, okay, all right, well, it'll turn up or it won't. And Tom, my husband, said to me, oh, you're being very good about that. Like, really surprised. Like, why are you not having it done? I went, well, Steve was not long with us. I went, well, Steve's right there. He was in the room. And I went, I can hardly go, oh my God, my poshest dress. Like when Steve's lost literally everything, like I can't. And Steve went, no, you can. It is annoying when your suitcase goes missing. He said, don't forget, I have had first world problems. He said, I get them, like it's not that I haven't ever had them. And he said to me, told me this story about once before the war, he had the perfect trousers that fit absolutely perfectly. And he loved them. He was quite into fashion. And they got a tiny hole in them, which he was going to fix. And his mother just threw them out, gave them to charity or something. And he was devastated. And he said, you know what? After the war and, 5 years displaced, the Calais jungle, I still think about those trousers. And he said, for him, a sign that he is getting better is that he tuts at red tape or waiting a long time for a bus. He's like, oh, God, how long is this going to take? And he said, when that happens, I'm like, oh, I'm getting better. I'm becoming normal again. That I'm frustrated by the things normal people are frustrated by. So he said, you don't have to compare your trauma to the worst trauma that anyone's ever had. It's everyone's living on their own path. But I have also seen the resilience and the determination to make this new life work. And, English will now be my first language. I will adapt to all of these cultural norms and customs, and I will find new love, new family, new life, new opportunity here, and I will build back into this system. And one of the interesting things that Steve said to me, we have lots of jokes about integration. Once, he met Paul McCartney and he went, is that integration? I've met a Beatle now. Is that integration? It was sort of like a joke about, he's always saying, like, am I British yet, sort of thing. And he said to me one day, my goal is to pay them as much tax as I can in this country in my lifetime, because I want to give back as much as I can, and to this country that has taken me in and in my time of need. And I went, don't say that at the Home Office. That's not integration. That's like, I've never heard a British person say that.
But I mean, it's extraordinary to hear you just sort of talk matter-of-factly about living with Steve, because it's not normal. I mean, especially for so many years. And lots of people talked about taking in Syrian refugees at the time of that huge exodus from Syria that became a very political moment. You actually did. But it doesn't sound like you did it in a sort of very thought-through way. It just kind of happened.
Oh, yeah, no, it did just happen. Yeah. So we live in a flat in Camden, which was quite a small flat, but then we managed to knock through upstairs. And so we suddenly had a spare bedroom, which was going to be my room of one's own, writer's room. And then I do a podcast called Global Pillage, which is kind of like a diversity-based QI type panel show. That's a podcast and a live show that people come to. We were doing a refugee season of podcasts where we were inviting refugees on podcasts to be themselves and talk about other things they knew about, and not just being a refugee, because Steve always says being a refugee is one chapter in your life. It doesn't define you. And a lot of refugees that he knew in Calais would refuse to say they were refugees. They'd be like, no, I'm just displaced. Because being a refugee it's a big deal thing in your life. It's like now, I think most British people, if something extraordinary happened here, an earthquake or suddenly we're invaded and we just all had to jump into dinghies and get off the Dover coast, it would take British people a very, very long time to admit they were refugees. A very long time. And a lot would never. They would say, no, I'm British in a boat. It's a big deal kind of label. So
British people aren't even immigrants. They're expats.
They're expats. Absolutely, absolutely. You never see British people say that they are migrants or immigrants. It's just the history of the world, and the labels people are happy to take on. But anyway, Steve came on this show and he did very well. I mean, his English is exceptional and he did brilliantly. And afterwards I was chatting to him in the bar and said, where are you staying? And he didn't have his papers yet. He was waiting for his papers and he said, oh, well, I'm sofa surfing at the moment with some friends that I met in the jungle. And Tom and I were going away and we had cats and Steve loved cats. And I said, well, do you want to mind the cats for 3 weeks? And when we came and went during that time and he was staying in the spare room and it just became clear that if he left, one of our cats would leave with him. And it was the better of the two cats. So I said to Tom, look, why don't we ask Steve to stay 3 months, which our mutual friend Charlotte had sort of taken me aside and said, I'd love Steve to be able to unpack for 3 months because he's not had a home in 6 years. And he was an architecture student at the University of Damascus, which was like, Oxbridge there, and was into fashion and bodybuilding. And, then suddenly you're homeless, and in that 3 months, towards the end of that 3 months, Steve got his papers, and being with someone and watching them get their human rights back when they have not had any human rights for 5 years. Like, he didn't have the right to a doctor. He didn't have the right to a lawyer. He didn't have the right to stand and breathe the air in any country. Like, the only place where he could live, he would surely die. And that means it's illegal for you to live on planet Earth. It's just not your planet.
How much of this do you think relates to your own identity, background? You come from Australia, but you were adopted. Is there a relationship between the two things?
Yes. I've never seen biology and family as inextricably linked. I've always known I was adopted. My parents used that word before I could understand what it meant. So they always said to me, you're adopted, when I was little. So I knew, they'd say, oh, you're special, we specially wanted you, that kind of thing that you say to a small child. As I got older and could ask more questions, they explained what that meant. My brother and sister are both biologically my parents, and I'm the only adoptee. But there was no difference in my family. So I never thought that blood relations means your family. And so I think I have always built family wherever I've gone. I truly believe you can choose family. That's why I think the Choose Love slogan, it really appeals to me, because any of us can choose to love. Any of us can choose. If you decide the old lady in the ground floor of your flat is your granny and you treat her like she's your granny, it will not take very long for her to become your granny. So I would say, Steve is my family as much as, more so than some of my biological family I've ever met, obviously. I've got biological family on one side that I've never met. And recently, fairly recently, connected with my biological mother and my sisters, which was an absolutely extraordinary experience, and that's another sort of coming into a family where you do look like everyone and you are biologically related, but you don't share any history. So you have to start making your memories from minute one as grown-ups.
So what was childhood like for you? Where were you?
I was raised in Queensland, which is not the most liberal state in Australia. I was always very naturally liberal. I never understood that kind of thinking, but that was very much the thinking of the state I was in. And I as soon as I could read books about like London and the United Kingdom, and I knew that's where I lived. I was like, oh, I live here with these children. I don't live here. I don't really get this place. And my family, lovely growing up, and I'm still very close to them, and but I didn't really fit in that place. Never really fit in.
And were you the family comedian?
Yes. Well, that's the other thing. The things that I was looking for when I found my biological family was I always wanted to live in London, slightly obsessively, for a child raised on a lovely beach in Australia. And I always a performer. And those things I couldn't really find in my nurture so much. So I knew that they must be nature.
I want to come to that in a second, but I'd like to sort of stay with growing up first as well, because you also had Jehovah's Witnesses in your family, didn't you?
Yeah, that was a curveball. I'll not lie to you there, Krishnan. That was a curveball I could have done without. When I was a teenager, my family became Jehovah's Witnesses. So I did have a lovely, lovely childhood in many ways, but I wouldn't recommend joining a high control group. I wouldn't recommend joining a high control group in your adolescence, because your brain is very plastic and you are actually looking for new tribe as an adolescent. It's an important part of your development. And so if you get connected with a cult at that time, you will get your brain is particularly plastic and especially looking for new tribes, so you can get very sucked into it.
Is that what you think it is? I mean, cult is a sort of very controversial word, isn't it?
A cult, a useful definition of a cult is any group that will not let you leave with your dignity intact. The reason I call the Jehovah's Witnesses a cult is because you are not allowed to associate with anyone outside that religious group. And if you are seen associating with anyone outside unnecessarily beyond your secular working hours, for example, if I were to go for a coffee with someone I was working with in a shop afterwards, we're having a coffee, and another Jehovah's Witness saw me, they would report me to the elders and say, I'm worried about Sister Deborah, she's associating with this worldly person. And the elders would take me aside and say, were you having a coffee with a worldly person? And then I would say, oh yes, she's a really nice lady, she works in the shop, and she just we were chatting and we had something in common, or she wanted to get some advice from me or something. And if I said I was witnessing to her, if I said, oh well, actually she's having real problems with her marriage and I was giving her a watchtower, then they'd say, okay then, but be careful that association is that one-way street. Don't start socializing with her. And so you can't associate with people outside, but the punishment for wanting to leave or breaking any of the rules, even if the elders decide you are rebellious in some way and they disfellowship you, the punishment is shunning. And that means everybody cuts you off. And that means even, Krishnan, if you and I were both Jehovah's Witnesses and we were best friends, which we wouldn't be because you're a man and I'm a woman, but if we were in some way, in a close social circle, and I got disfellowshipped, next time I saw you walking down the street, you would have to look away like you could not see me. If I was in the same cafe as you, you would have to pretend you couldn't see me, like dead to me.
So did you ever buy into it? Or did you always hate it?
Yes. Oh, no, I 100%. That's what I was saying. My brain was very plastic, and I 100% thought that Jehovah God was in the sky and that Armageddon was going to come. And I needed to tell as many people as possible. Otherwise, they would die at Armageddon. That was my responsibility in my job. That's why I was knocking on doors full-time and working in a shop part-time to support myself, because knocking on doors doesn't pay anything.
So how did you leave?
Well, I did what they now call fading. I did not get disfellowshipped. You can do, there is one thing you can do, which is if you stop going, it's hard to do that if you're in the one place because the elders will come and try and meet with you. But I moved and then I didn't go back. And so I never got to fellowship, and I was very keen not to get to fellowship.
But at what point did you decide you wanted to leave? I mean, if you were bought in and you believed all this stuff, at what point did you start thinking this is wrong?
I was a nanny, and I moved in with the family. That was the beginning of the end, because I was living with a family who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, who were really nice, and I'd already started to have serious doubts because of some of the experiences that I've had in the organisation that I won't go into. But I was already feeling very disillusioned. And then the reason they don't want you to have a coffee with Sarah after work is it's going to wear off if you hang out with other people. And I moved in with a family, and I started to go, hold on, these people are really happy and living this perfectly, joyful life without all of this. And I started to wake up and think, I don't think any of this is true. I don't think Armageddon is coming.
I mean, by reputation, it's a very male-dominated culture as well. Is that where the feminism comes from?
Yes. It's an organisation in which no decision has ever been made, to my or anyone else's knowledge, by a woman in the history of the organisation. And that includes when the Kingdom Hall is cleaned and who's on the roster. All decisions are taken by men. There are no administrative duties carried out by women unless there are no men in that congregation. So say you've got some kind of very remote congregation, there are 6 sisters and no brothers, obviously they have to take those responsibilities. But that would be an extreme situation. I was sort of sometimes allowed to get away with things because I was a pioneer, which meant I was full-time at door knocking. And I would say things. I would find scriptures in the Bible about the way women were treated in the Bible and what problems I had with that. And I would extrapolate about maybe in the new system things would be different. The new system is the sort of paradise on earth that comes after Armageddon. And so, of course, if I said things like that, people would say you can't say that. And but I think they thought I was a bit fun. It was because I was funny about it. I would do comedy bits. And that's what I was known for. Actually, that's where I learned to do stand-up comedy, was in the Jehovah's Witnesses, because women could not speak from the platform, but we were allowed to do little plays. So like once a week at this theocratic ministry school where you meant to be demonstrating you were getting good at knocking on doors, we would do this little, like a sketch where you'd go, knock, knock, knock. Good morning. I was wondering if you ever worry about the future. Why, I do. Please come in, which never happened in real life. And I worked out pretty quickly, because I'd done a lot of drama at school, again, because I'd had sort of morphed out of the world into the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'd done a lot of drama at school, and I'd always been funny. I was on the debating team, and I was always third speaker, and the whole thing for me was how many laughs could I get? So this was the only opportunity for performance. So I used to think, how many laughs can I get? And I worked out that the Jehovah's Witnesses found nothing funnier than taking the piss out of the born-again Christians. So I used to like make my household a born-again Christian, and I would give her lots of set-up lines, and I would ask her lots of questions and get her to read scriptures. Anyway, it's not going to be funny to you, but it was absolutely hysterical in the Mermaid Beach congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. So I would have got a 5-star review there. And they asked me to do those little demonstrations at the big like football stadium conventions because I was funny.
I mean, let's talk about the Guilty Feminist then. I mean, apart from being sort of entertaining and funny, there are big ideas in the Guilty Feminist. I mean, why do you think it's been such a success?
Women are thirsty, honestly. There is not a lot of content made for and by women. Nearly everything you see on the television that's made for women is not really made by women, not exclusively. And even if it is, it's made under power structures that were created for and by men. So I think the Guilty Feminist came out at a time when feminism was re-emerging as a movement. And listen, there's always been feminists and they've always been working very, very hard. But I remember seeing Gloria Steinem speak a few years ago, and she said a movement has to be moving somewhere. And the question is, where are we going? And I think for a long time, we weren't really moving anywhere. And I feel like that movement started moving again, as these things do. They wax and they wane. Around 2012, 2013, suddenly there was a lot of, popular feminism, reigniting. In this country, there was Caitlin Moran and Bridget Christie. And then at the same time, there was, this extraordinary figure of Malala, who had, with other young women, stood up and said, we will go to school, and paid almost the ultimate price for that. There was Chimamanda, We Should All Be Feminists. There was all of Bill Cosby's accusers got together on the front cover of a magazine and said, look at all of our faces together. Are we all lying? Are we all making this up? You could see the beginnings of Me Too there. And I wanted to be part of this. This is something that when I'd left the Jehovah's Witnesses, I'd gone to university, and I went to Oxford in 97. And it was all, the Spice Girls and girl power, and, there was a lot of kicking the air. But most of it was very ladette culture, really. It was like, yeah, we can be like boys. And that was kind of it. And I remember being in the junior common room at Oxford, trying to talk about feminism, and having other women say, we've got equality now. You're going to look like you're asking for an unfair advantage. I was really disappointed by it. And I think I thought, oh, well, I can't really, it's not much better out here than it was in there. And I think by the time this came around in 2012, 2013, where there was this sort of resurgence, I wanted to do it, but I genuinely did feel like I'm a feminist, but am I good enough to kind of call myself a feminist? Because a lot of the feminists I could see, they were so strident and so certain and so sure, and I wasn't sure, because I knew really that I wanted things that were ignoble, that I had hypocrisies. And one of the first things I ever admitted, which was true, is I'm a feminist, but this is how we start every podcast. I'm a feminist, but one time I went on a women's rights march, and I popped into a department store to use the loo. And when I was in there, I got distracted trying out face cream. And when I came out, the march was gone. And I remember thinking, oh, no, I'm a terrible feminist. But the thing is, when I said that, I thought, my God, I might just get kicked out of the club. Everyone might go, yes, you are a terrible feminist. But of course, women just laughed and just went, yeah, I've done that. And, so many women said to me, I've been on a march, I've just think it's too crowded, it's too much for me now. And I've ended up saying to my friend, can we just stop for a quick drink? And then we've ended up just saying, we just can't go back to that. That's just too much, too many people. And the amount of women that have admitted to me that they've left a march is extraordinary. But you still went, and you were counted, and you tried. And then the next time, first time you go to a march, it's intimidating and it goes on for a long time. But you build up your stamina. You go on another march and you stay longer. And then by the end, you're carrying signs and you're up the front. You've got to build muscle. And most of the things we admit in our I'm a Feminist parts are not important. And we laugh at them and we exfoliate them and they're gone. When you carry them and you don't talk about them, guilt, if carried on the body, turns into shame. And shame is luggage. And luggage is something that needs to be brought around with you. So if you were going to watch that, BBC4 documentary about the suffragettes, and instead you watched 3 hours of Say Yes to the Dress or Love Island, the next day you go into your meeting and you think, right, I'm going to speak up about this because they're doing this panel. There's not one woman on the panel. There's 4 white guys again. And I know that Sadia would be brilliant for this panel. She's actually more qualified. Why has no one thought of Sadia? And you want to speak up in this panel. You want to say, you've got not only a woman, you've got a woman of colour who could come on this panel, who is at least as qualified, if not more qualified. I really want to ask the question, why is her name not on the list? And if you're carrying that shame of I'm not a very good feminist, because am I a feminist really if I watch Love Island instead of the suffragette documentary, you are less likely to speak up. So when we put it on the table and we laugh about those things and we exfoliate them, or if they do need working on, build muscle, let's talk about it, let's develop. You are much more entitled. You feel much more entitled to take up space in the rest of the world.
And do you think that sort of the liberating nature of revealing what you're feeling guilty about applies more generally as well?
Yes. I think the podcast has become much more intersectional. I'll be honest with you. When I started the podcast 4.5 years ago, I mostly started it to wallow in my own oppression. What I've learned about more than anything is my own privilege. I realise now how privileged I am. And and how many doors will open for me because I'm white and I'm tall and I went to Oxford, and I had a little bit of oppression to overcome in coming out of a cult, and that makes you a bit feisty. So there's loads of ways that I am privileged, and it is not as simple as to say women, men. There are so many, many, many more marginalised women and people of minority genders than me, that I'm in a better position sometimes to speak up for those people who are in a minority position, as I hope that men would speak up for me. But I also have to acknowledge that those intersections do not fall directly on gender lines. There are many, many men who are far more marginalised than me, who are far more oppressed than me, who have far less voice than me. And so my feminism has become much more about closing power gaps and trying to fight injustice wherever it is. And sometimes it isn't along gender lines. And I know that annoys some feminists that I do that sometimes I speak up for men, but I just can't pretend that I have a harder life than the average black man. I obviously don't. This is not to minimise. This is not to minimise gendered oppression, because there are black women in a situation who can be marginalised and oppressed from every single direction. But I do need to acknowledge that. And also, one thing that I learned from Steve is when we were talking about women and children first, in his situation where he's been in dinghy. So absolutely, of course, you get out. As a man, you get out because you need to drown before a woman or a child drowns. And I'm like, but why? I get it with children; they've got more life to live. But we had a really long discussion about where this has come from and what this is about. Do you think it's wrong? Women and children first.
Or women first.
Look, okay, all right. Obviously, with the children, we can all agree children need to be protected and they can't protect themselves. But my question to you is, if we are all in boats off the coast of Dover, pretending we're not refugees, pretending we're expats in boats, and there's a young man who's like 21, who's got more life ahead of him than me, is probably going to be more useful with the children, has probably got better upper body strength than me, will probably sink the dinghy less quickly because he probably weighs less than me. Why is he getting out? And I mean, let's just step back from that. Logically, I should get out, but everything tells us he should get out because women and children first. And I would like to think, I would say, actually, you stay and I'm going to get out. But I can't promise you that at 2 o'clock in the morning and it's freezing cold and inky black that I would, because the power structures say that's my spot in the boat. And it's hard to get out of a boat of privilege. The same way it's hard for 12 men on a board to sit there and say which one of us is going to get out because a woman needs to get on this board. In fact, 6 of us should get out and let 6 women on because half of our customer base is female.
Do you think
that's better?
That's really interesting. I mean, do you think that's what needs to happen? That's...
I think it's hard to get out of a boat of privilege, though. It's hard to be the one to say, everything about this power structure is telling me I should get out, but I don't want to because it's nice in this boat of privilege.
What have you made of the last few months of government, and very visible government, particularly with these daily briefings, in terms of progress or otherwise? I mean, you can cut it different ways, can't you? You can say this government's very progressive. We've got an Asian chancellor, an Asian woman as a home secretary. You've got powerful women in powerful places. Or you could say, I look at this daily briefing from the government every day and I just see these white middle-aged men, and I wonder if we've gone back in time. How have you seen it?
Sometimes the only woman who can be promoted is the woman who takes on the values of the most patriarchal part of the power structure. So if you're prepared to say, I will either my natural values sit with theirs, or I will change my values so they will sit with theirs. You can get promoted because they know that they need to be seen to be having in the cabinet, for example, some women, some people of colour, some women of colour. So if you say, I will not speak on behalf of any women of colour, I will not act on behalf of any women of colour, I will not give you any problems, I will act in the best interest of the dominant group and the power base, then your chances of promotion are really high. Because the optics are, but look, this person is brown, this person is female.
Isn't there a lesson then for all women and people of colour, that if you act like a middle-aged white male, you'll get on?
And you protect the values of middle-aged white men, of rich. No, I'm going to say this further: rich middle-aged white men. There are working-class white men in this country who the least likely person to go to university in this country is a working-class white man. It is particularly about rich, influential men who are white, who went to the right school. You can be anyone can be an honorary, rich, old white man. Anyone can be. You just have to serve the values of rich, old white men. And right now, there is a sense in our community that everybody needs to be represented. So yeah, it is possible to get on, but you do need to serve the values of that dominant group first. And if you will serve the needs of that group foremost, and in fact exclusively, I reckon you've got a really good chance of getting Priti Patel's job.
Let's suppose you're right with that analysis. Is it worth it? Is it worth it for the change in representation?
No.
Because won't it have a long-term effect?
Representation is probably always useful to some extent, because there are children watching TV. So if you're a little girl and you're just seeing, you're a little brown girl and you're seeing brown female faces on the television, you may not really understand what they're saying. The fact that people like you can be in places of influence and be on the television and be in the House of Commons, there is some value always in representation. But it is not worth, in my opinion, representing the identities if you will not stand up for those people who share your identities. So if your identity is that you are female and that you are Asian, yes, the optics of that will do something for that next generation of young girls. But if you will not speak for those girls, if you will not act for those girls, in my opinion, you'd be better off not taking the job. What are you doing? What are you doing? I would absolutely rather have a white man in who will fight for the rights, for the representation, for the legislation that will help marginalised people than Priti Patel, who is not fighting for any of those things.
Obviously, she's not in this conversation to explain or to defend herself, but I guess she might say, there's more to me than being an Asian woman, and there's more to my identity. I don't need to be defined by that. And actually, my political identity is entirely different, and that's what I'm more interested in.
I guess she might, but she's not currently doing anything to help somebody like her. The decisions she makes life easier for people whose life is already the easiest, and difficult for those whose lives are most difficult. And that seems to me to be a very poor use of power and influence.
Let's come back to you and identity and children. You you tried to have children through IVF, and you had talked about this in the past. So could you just talk me through what your thought process was? Because I suppose, again, being adopted yourself, people might say, well, if you were struggling to have children yourself, did you think about adoption?
I did. I would love to have adopted. I absolutely would have loved to have done that. But it's so difficult now. And there's sort of years of people coming into your house and assessing it. And at that point, we didn't have a spare room. So there was no way to start that process. So I thought, if I start IVF and, then you have the baby and then you can keep the baby in your room and then you can, knock through upstairs or find a bigger place or, there's ways of dealing with it. But I did look into adoption and it just didn't seem, there were all sorts of reasons why it didn't seem possible. It was most likely we would adopt an older child, which again, I would love to have done, but then you really have to completely be there and focus on that child, because that child in some way or another has been neglected or their attachments have been disrupted for whatever reason. And you have to be absolutely, I think, completely full-time focused. And I still wanted to develop in my career. So I thought, if I have IVF, there's ways of managing this. And I had IUI a couple of times. And then when it came to IVF, it became clear that my eggs weren't viable and I needed a donor egg. And I got an egg from Russia because for some reason it's easier to get an egg from Russia, something about legislation in various countries. And then I found my biological family. And it turned out they were in New Zealand. My birth mother had moved to New Zealand from Australia after I was born, and she'd had 3 girls there. So I had 3 half sisters. And I'd gone back and I'd just met them that night. And the next night, my sisters knocked on my bedroom door where I was doing some emails, and I opened the door and they were there with a bottle of wine. And do you mind if we come in? They said, coming in. And they sat on the bed and we drank the bottle of wine. And the only way I can describe it is that by the end of the bottle of wine, we were sisters. And they just asked me loads of questions about myself. And one of the things Mel asked me was, my sister Mel, who's most like me, I think, in nature, she said, like, we've all got children. Have you wanted children? Do you want children? Are you going to have them? And I said, well, actually, I'm going to start IVF when I get back. I've got a donor egg. I've got a Russian egg. And she went, oh, don't use a Russian egg. You don't know where it's from. And I said, well, I do. Russia, that's the key thing. This is about the only thing I know about it. And she said, no. She said, I'll give you an egg. I'll give you an egg, because then the baby will be biologically partly yours. So yes, I'll give you an egg. And I was like, oh, okay, right. Okay. Now I'm not here for an egg. I just thought, my God, they're going to think I've come for an egg and a kidney, a payday loan. I was like, no, Mel, you've got it all right. I'm not here for an egg. I've got an egg. It's all good. Good for eggs. So many eggs. And she was like, no. I've always wanted to do that for someone. I'm going to give you an egg. And I was like, well, look, emotions are high. We met yesterday and, it was this big, extraordinary reunion because we look so similar. And I said, why don't I go back to London and then you have a think about it. I'll have a think about it. And, we'll talk in a few weeks and see how we're feeling. And she went, no, I'm giving you an egg. I'm going to ring the clinic tomorrow. So the next day we all go out for brunch. And my birth mother, Devon, says she's going to treat everyone. And she goes up to the counter to pay. And we're all just sitting there and there's kids everywhere and stuff. And I think, I'm really feeling like part of this family. This is really lovely. And Devon, my birth mother, comes and sits down. And Mel looks at Devon when she sits down and says, Mum, I'm giving Deborah one of my eggs. And Devon says, did you not want the full breakfast? And she said, no, Mum, not one of my eggs Benedict, not one of my eggs Benedict, one of my eggs from my body so she can have a baby. And I was like, oh, God. Like, everybody just literally said, no, Devon, I'm not here for an egg. I've got a Russian egg. And she went, oh, don't use a Russian egg. You don't know where it's from. Where do you know where it's from? And I was so mortified that maybe they thought I wanted this, but they didn't. They were just so sweet about it. But I do remember my brother-in-law leaning over and saying to me, well, if it's a boy, you'll have to call him Benedict. But so anyway, Mel came over. Mel did it. She came over So it was such an odd thing, you know, because in the morning, we'd go and have some really invasive medical procedures. And then in the afternoon, we'd go to the Tower of London. In the morning, we'd go and, you know, get injected with all sorts of hormones and things in every orifice. Then in the evening, we'd go and see Rock of Ages. It was so odd. And it didn't work. But strangely, it did, because it kind of made us sisters. There's something about, I think, taking on biology and losing, you cannot help but win if you are genetically connected, because, you know, when things are taken out of somebody's body and put into somebody else's body, there is a greater connection. And also, because Devon came with her and my other sister lives in Scotland, we had this sort of strange, it was almost like being teenagers, because we'd go off to things and, you know, they'd sort of get up to hijinks and, you know, Mel would say, oh, don't tell Mum about that, or like, tell her I stayed at your place or whatever, you know, and it was so much fun and it felt like a sort of slightly teenage experience. So I'll never regret doing that. I'll never regret trying. And to be honest, I don't really regret it not working. I think my life and my career is so exciting now. I also think, had my life been full and my spare room had been full and my headspace had been full of trying to juggle a career and a child, I would not have invited Steve Vanni into my home. So I wouldn't have had the space or the energy. And I once said to Steve, when we were having an emotional moment, he was feeling emotional about something, I don't believe things happen for a reason. I think things happen for a rationalization. Now, otherwise, I've got to think the war in Syria happened for a reason. You know, I've got to think everything happened. I don't believe that. I think we rationalize them. We say, but if I hadn't split up with John, I never would have gone to Japan and met Kenji, and he's the love of my life. I think that's how we work. But if I did think everything happened for a reason, I would think that the reason I didn't have children is so I could have Steve. And I could be there at that very crucial period of his life, when he needed family and connection and stability and home so much. And, you know, I know that it means a lot to him when I say, we really miss you in lockdown. We can't wait for you to come home. When are you coming home? And I think that concept of home, you know, it's made up. But if you make it up, it's real.
That's a lovely way of thinking about it. I think I've kind of got to get to the end question, and that is, I mean, you talked about how you see the world really eloquently throughout this. I mean, if you could change the world in any way you wanted, how would you change it?
If I could ignite everybody's compassion, everybody's empathy, everybody has it. Everybody has it. I think almost everybody has it anyway. If I could somehow open up every human being's ability to understand what it's like to be somebody else, and sit looking at that other person for a while, that empathy that does open up when you live next door to somebody. You know, there are people who would say, you know, we don't want those refugees here, but then they live across the road from somebody who makes a friendly gesture, a friendly connection, and they can exceptionalize. They can say, well, we don't want a lot of refugees here, but that family across that, they're actually lovely. They're actually lovely, and they brought that bread across that time, and that was really nice. And actually, they were really good to Martha when she was ill. And that ability to connect and have compassion is in everybody when they're face to face. But when they're around the corner, when they're across the road, when they're in the ocean, when they're in Calais, that ability, it dims. And I'd like to be able to turn that light up in all of us. I just want more people to know people who don't have the same story, who have a different story, because every single time that happens, a little bit of understanding opens up and opens up and opens up and opens up. And we can do that. That's doable. We can change the world in this way. This is not philosophical. This is not hypothetical. This is not a magic wand. We just need to tell better stories and connect people better and get them face to face. Whatever influence you have, use it to tell someone else's story, or better yet, allow them to tell their own story. And somebody else's heart or mind will be changed just a little bit. We do that every day, we change the world.
Deborah Frances-White, thank you so much. It's been absolutely lovely to talk to you. Thanks for sharing your ways to change the world. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.